Brazil's former president Jair Bolsonaro has begun a 27-year prison sentence for leading a coup attempt, a development some protest and some celebrate.
U.S. President Donald Trump says he'll be deploying his special envoys to hold further discussions with Ukraine and Russia as he intensifies his push for peace.
The European Court of Justice ruled EU countries must recognize a marriage between EU citizens of the same sex.
Strengthening a partnership based on shared values, this was the message of the 7th summit between the European Union and the African Union.
Brazil's former president Jair Bolsonaro has begun a 27-year prison sentence for leading a coup attempt in a development that has stunned much of the country. A Supreme Court justice ruled on Tuesday that Bolsonaro's legal team has exhausted all appeals, ordering him to remain in custody after a preemptive arrest on Saturday. Bolsonaro's supporters and opponents gathered outside the federal police headquarters after the order was issued, with many calling for his release, while others celebrated his imprisonment. The former president had been under house arrest since August and was taken into custody last weekend after trying to tamper with his ankle monitor. He blamed the incident on hallucinations, a claim the judge dismissed. Bolsonaro is being held in a 12-square-meter room at federal police headquarters in Brasilia, with a bed, private bathroom, air conditioning, a TV and a desk, and no contact with other inmates. Bolsonaro and several allies were convicted for attempting to overthrow Brazil's democracy after 2022 election defeat, in a plot that included plans to kill then-President-elect Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Vice President Geraldo Alckmin, and the presiding justice figures. Several senior allies, including army generals and former ministers, have also started serving sentences in military and civilian facilities, while a former intelligence chief remains at large in the United States.
U.S. President Donald Trump says his plan to end the war in Ukraine has been fine-tuned to address concerns of both sides after U.S. mediators held talks with Russia and Ukraine. Trump says he believes a deal can be reached soon, noting that he'll be deploying his special envoy Steve Witkoff to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin next week. Trump, aboard Air Force One, also announced that he'll be dispatching U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll to hold further discussions with Ukrainian officials.
We're having good talks. We started with Russia. We're having some talks with Russia. Ukraine is doing well. I think they're pretty happy about it. They'd like to see it end. And we won't know for a little while, but we're making progress. They're going to keep talking. They're talking to Russia now. Steve Witkoff is going over. Maybe with Jared, they're going to be meeting with President Putin, I believe, next week in Moscow.
In its original form, Trump's plan heavily favored Russia, requiring Ukraine to cede a large amount of territory, which included the entirety of the eastern Donbass region, most of which is currently controlled by Russia. The terms of the proposal raised concern among many European leaders who reject the premise of Ukraine ceding land. On Tuesday, leaders of the Coalition of the Willing, including French President Emmanuel Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, held talks to discuss the new peace push. They emphasized their support for Trump's efforts, stressing that talks are going in a positive direction. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky indicated on Monday that large parts of Trump's plan is acceptable to Ukraine. He noted, however, that he'd like to meet with Trump as soon as convenient to iron out final details for a framework for peace.
Thank you. That's really important.
EU countries must recognize a marriage between EU citizens of the same sex lawfully concluded in another member state. This is what the European Court of Justice ruled on Tuesday. Refusing to do so is contrary to EU law and infringes the freedom and the right to respect for private and family life, the EU's top court said. It ruled Poland was wrong not to recognize the marriage certificate of a Polish couple who married in Berlin in 2018 and then moved back to Poland on the ground that Polish law does not permit marriage between persons of the same sex. Polish lawmakers' reactions were mixed.
Pytanie jest w tej chwili takie, w jaki sposób miałby się odbyć kwestia implementacji do polskiego prawa. No bo jeżeli to ma przejść przez polskie prawodawstwo, czyli Sejm, Senat i podpis prezydenta, No to nie możemy doprowadzać do sytuacji takiej, już pomijając pewne kwestie takie typowo związane ze swoim takim indywidualnym podejściem do tej sprawy, który każdy z polityków pewnie ma, do tego, żeby łamać konstytucję.
Mam nadzieję, że to będzie przełomowy wyrok. Mam nadzieję, że polskie instytucje teraz głęboko się zastanowią, w jaki sposób respektować małżeństwa zawarte poza granicami Polski, małżeństwa osób tej samej płci, bo jednak jesteśmy członkiem Unii Europejskiej.
16 EU countries recognize same-sex marriage in the EU. In addition, 6 more countries recognize civil unions or partnerships for same-sex couples. 5 member states do not recognize any form of official union for same-sex couples.
Europe must stand firm by its digital rules was the message sent by Margrethe Vestager, former European Commissioner for Competition. Interviewed by Euronews on the Europe Today programme, the Danish Liberal politician called on the EU not to bow to American pressure for weaker implementation of European digital rules.
One thing is important, and that is that we have promised Europeans that their services would be safe to use for their mental health, for their democracy as such. And that is, of course, core in any democracy.
Vestager urged the EU to stand by its landmark legislation of the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act, both approved during the former EU Commissioner's tenure, which lasted between 2014 and 2024.
Thank you.
Strengthening a partnership based on shared values. This was the message of the 7th summit between the European Union and the African Union, which concluded on Tuesday in Luanda. Participants particularly emphasized the need to achieve peace on all continents through multilateralism
and finance.
There are no alternative for the multilateral and the international rules-based order, because the alternative is simply the chaos. And we need to avoid the chaos. We need to uphold for the international order in Ukraine, in RDC, in Gaza, in Sudan, elsewhere.
The two partners also welcomed the progress made in implementing the Global Gateway. This 150 billion euros program to support African countries is intended to strengthen growth and accelerate climate and digital transitions.
At least 6 people were killed in Russian strikes targeting residential and energy positions in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and the northeastern Sumy region overnight into Tuesday. Video footage circulating online showed a residential building in the central Pechursk district and another in the eastern Dniprovsky district to have suffered strikes, later confirmed by Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Ukraine's energy minister noted, without adding detail, that the overnight barrage also targeted some of the country's energy infrastructure. In separate attacks, officials in Sumy announced that a service truck stationed in an area that was victim to repeated Russian attacks late into Monday was struck by a drone in the early hours of Tuesday. The attacks come after U.S. and Ukrainian delegations held talks in the Swiss city of Geneva about a U.S.-Russia brokered peace plan. Ukraine says the talks were very constructive, stating that it shared and discussed almost all of its concerns with the U.S. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said on Monday that Russia had not seen the updated plan following the talks.
A Lithuanian court convicted an 18-year-old of performing an arson attack on an IKEA store in Vilnius last year. The court found he acted on behalf of Russian security services and found him guilty of charges including a terrorist act and illegal possession of explosives. The teenager Daniil Bardadim pleaded guilty to the charges. He was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison. Europe has recently been the target of a wave of arson and other sabotage attacks, with Russia accused of being behind them. The Swedish company is thought to have been targeted because the company withdrew from Russia, as well as because of Sweden's support for Ukraine. The store in Vilnius was attacked in May in 2024, when an explosive device set off early in the morning.
Four more people have been arrested in connection with last month's jewellery heist at the Louvre, according to the Paris prosecutor's office on Tuesday. The 2 men and 2 women in custody are from the Paris region and range in age from 31 to 40, said the prosecutor Laure Bécuot. The office did not say what role they are suspected of having played in the theft. But according to local media, one of the men arrested was a member of the 4-man team thought to have carried out the robbery. Magistrates have previously filed preliminary charges against 3 men and a woman arrested in October over the heist. It took the thieves less than 8 minutes to steal jewels worth €88 million.
Greece's former Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras blasted his ex-finance minister Yanis Varoufakis in his recently released memoir. Tsipras argued that Varoufakis was, quote, more a celebrity than an economist. He also said he underestimated the human factor when appointing him as finance minister during Greece's debt crisis in 2015. A decade ago, Tsipras rose to power on an anti-austerity agenda. However, the former prime minister appeared on track to lead Greece out of the eurozone. Despite a referendum in which Greeks rejected the bloc's proposed bailout terms, Tsipras ignored the results and accepted a new package with harsher austerity measures. Varoufakis resigned over the ex-prime minister's decision to reverse course. On Tuesday, Varoufakis commented on the release of the memoir, saying he had not read the book and would instead wait for the movie to be released.